Welcome back to Vuln Vibes. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Emby exploit. We are dedicating this deep dive to drilling down into CVE-2025-64113. This is a critical zero precondition API vulnerability in Emby Server and is highlighted by that GitHub Security Advisory GHSA 95V5GFJ2R84. And this isn't just another server flaw, this is really a textbook case of a security perimeter just collapsing under a surprisingly simple API error.
It absolutely is. And for our professional security audience, I think the mission today is to really dissect that kill chain. How does a single unauthenticated API call lead directly to, well, full administrative control? We need to analyze the mechanism that made this a critical, a 9.8 or 10.0 risk, and then really evaluate the vendor's rapid response. Specifically that unconventional plugin-based patching strategy they used.
The bottom line, for anyone out there running the software, is that the threat is immediate. The risk profile is, well, it's MAC-fragile. This vulnerability lets an attacker gain full admin access to the Emby server. And the critical factor here is the total lack of specific preconditions. If an attacker can reach it on the network, they own it. That's the definition of a highly dangerous fire-and-forget vector.
Yeah, when we talk about threat modeling, a zero precondition exploit is always the apex predator. This kind of flaw just bypasses the need for social engineering or existing credentials or even, complex timing attacks. It really elevates the risk from a targeted threat to mass scanning, highly automated opportunism.
Okay, so let's start with the scope and the core flaw itself. Emby Server versions, both the stable and the beta channels up to and including 4.9.1.A0, were squarely in the crosshairs. That's a huge install base that needed immediate attention.
It is a massive scope, yeah. And for any IR teams responding to this, defining that blast radius accurately is just crucial. The advisory is pretty careful to note that while an attacker gets full application administrative access, so they control users, content, metadata, configs, API keys, everything within that Emby environment, the exploit does not inherently grant OS-level access. And that separation is vital. It means the application layer is fully compromised, but the underlying host OS should remain logically separate.
Right. That distinction prevents immediate lateral movement via the OS, which is a small comfort, I guess. But let's be clear, admin control of a networked application is still total compromise. And the exploitability metrics, -PRN, UIN, that's what truly terrifies incident responders. That's the signature of a vulnerability that requires no credentials, no human interaction.
Exactly. When you see PRN privileges required, none, and UIN, user interaction, none. That immediately signals a high-volume, highly automated attack capability. The attack doesn't have to wait for a user to click a bad link, and the attacker doesn't need a valid session token. It's raw, unauthenticated API access. This is why just having the server exposed on the network, even if it's not internet-facing, but accessible from an untrusted segment, is enough.
Which brings us to the root cause. The advisory tags this flaw under CW640, weak password recovery mechanism for forgotten password. But for our audience, I think that label's a bit too generic. What do we suspect was the actual failure point in the mechanism that allowed this?
That's where the analysis gets deep, right? CW640 doesn't just mean a weak token. It means a fundamental failure in the state machine or the authentication flow. In this type of vulnerability, the forgot password endpoint is almost certainly failing to perform adequate authorization checks. Typically, when this happens without authentication, the server is doing one of two things. Either it's generating a highly predictable or static reset token that an attacker can just calculate, or what's more likely here, given the zero precondition nature, the API is allowing a stateless execution of the password change function.
Stateless execution, that's the key failure mode here.
Precisely. The process should look like request reset, then server sends token via email, then user submits that token and the new password. If the API endpoint for that final step, submit token and new password, fails to securely bind that request to a valid, non-expired, and unique challenge token, or if it doesn't correctly validate the target user identity, then the attacker can just execute that final step against the admin user, effectively hijacking the session state and bypassing all the necessary authorization. That's the critical flaw. A fundamental breakdown.
Okay, now that we understand the mechanism, let's pivot to how the industry officially scored this risk. This takes us directly to the CVSS v4 metrics. And the provided string, it's a masterpiece of brevity and risk assessment. CVSS.4.0 EV.NAC.NUI.NGUI.NVI.HVI.HAC LSI LSI.
That string tells the whole story for a security architect. It really does. If you focus on the exploitability group, the metrics are unanimous. AVN for network access,
So remote.
remote ACL for low complexity, ATN for no attack requirements, and critically, that PR.NUIN combination. It just confirms that minimal effort yields maximal result. It's an easy button for remote exploitation demanding immediate, aggressive remediation from anyone exposed.
So trivial exploitability, we can confirm that. Let's immediately jump to the impact side then, the vulnerable system impact, where we see VCH, VIH, VAH. Now, for a media server, which, many organizations might categorize as non-essential, why the triple high score? What are the real implications of HH in this context?
Oh, the triple high is absolutely warranted because the attacker achieves full administrative control over the application. Let's break down the implications beyond just data access. Confidentiality high, VCH. This isn't just movie titles. Emby servers often manage PII user email addresses, viewing habits, maybe login tokens for third-party services, potentially billing data depending on the setup.
Right.
Full admin means full data exfiltration.
And integrity.
Integrity high, VIH. The attacker can use the server as a persistence mechanism. They can inject malicious scripts, modify server settings to route traffic, or use the storage volume to host malware. They can turn the media server into a pivot point for launching further attacks against the internal network.
And availability.
Availability high, VAH. The attacker can lock out the legitimate admin, change network bindings, or just delete the configuration and the database. I mean, you've got a denial of service or an effective ransomware scenario on the application layer. That total control warrants the high scores.
That really elevates the perceived risk way beyond just a media server. It's an exposed, authenticated data store and a potential launchpad. However, there is a boundary limitation we noted in the CVSS string. The subsequent system context metrics are all low. SCL, SIL, SAL.
And that contrast is essential for threat modeling. It reinforces what we said earlier, that the advisory scope is confined to the application layer. The CVSS score reflects that the vulnerable application itself is owned, but there's no immediate proven path for the attacker to transition that privilege into OS kernel access or directly compromise an adjacent system. So the integrity of the rest of the enterprise network is rated as minimally affected by this specific vector, which, guides proper containment.
That structural limitation is absolutely critical for containment planning. It prevents this from being a full-blown, wormable catastrophe.
Okay.
Moving on, let's analyze the vendor response and the remediation strategy. They moved fast, releasing official patches, 4.9.190 for stable and 4.9.2.7 for beta.
A textbook rapid response. But the truly fascinating part is the deployment mechanism they chose for the immediate fix. They rolled out a critical patch via an update to one of the default included Emby Server plugins, not just through the major server version update cycle.
That's an unusual approach for a core API vulnerability. Why take the plugin route instead of just forcing a mandatory full server update? Was this about speed, or was there maybe a risk of breaking backward compatibility if they rushed the main release?
I believe it was a calculated tactical maneuver. It was all about deployment velocity and minimizing user friction, which is a massive headache in vulnerability management. In decentralized infrastructure like Emby servers, many users delay or manually control major server version updates. They worry about stability, compatibility.
Sure, they don't want to break their setup.
Exactly. But plugin updates, those are often configured by default to run automatically in the background. By wrapping the core API fix into a plugin update, they basically circumvented the administrator's manual intervention requirement. And the result was a much faster, much wider deployment coverage across the vulnerable installed base. We're talking hours, not days or weeks.
That is a phenomenal case study in modern vulnerability response agility, using user behavior against the exploit. It's an admission that vendor patch rates are often dictated by user inaction, and they found a clever way around it.
It absolutely highlights a gap in many organizations' security postures. That reliance on manual updates, even for critical infrastructure. This strategic choice allowed them to patch the vulnerability quickly without waiting for full user uptake of the major version release.
Now, for those interested in the logic of mitigation, the advisory provided a technical workaround. It's obsolete now, but it's incredibly instructional. It gives us a direct insight into the defense in-depth thinking for a CVE-640 flaw.
Right. The immediate remedy involved restricting file system permissions on a specific configuration file, passwordreset.txt. This file is seemingly integral to the vulnerable password reset mechanism. It's likely where the system writes temporary state or tokens during the recovery process.
So the goal was to deny the ability of the vulnerable API function to write to that file, thereby breaking the exploit chain.
Precisely. It's an elegant, low-level mitigation. For Windows users, the fix was setting explicit DE9 permissions for authenticated users on passwordreset.txt. On Linux, the classic method, sudochmod 444 passwordreset.txt, making the file read-only and immutable by the API service account. So when the attacker's requests hit the API endpoint, the underlying process would try the file system interaction, fail because of permissions, and the exploit chain would be broken. A direct file permission check stopping a critical API exploit. That's a powerful lesson in applying strict file system least privilege.
That mechanical mitigation really zeroes in on the resource dependency the exploit required. It shows that even when application logic fails, defense in depth at the file system level can still save the day. So what does this entire saga mean for us as security professionals?
I think the takeaways are pretty clear. First, the ubiquity of these zero precondition API flaws, the PRN UIN type, requires a radical shift in our perimeter monitoring. Any exposed API surface has to be considered hostile until proven otherwise. Second, CWE 640 shows that convenience features, password recovery, guest access, public APIs are consistently high-value targets when they're poorly implemented. And finally, if an exploit is AVN, network exploitable, the operational calculus must always be immediate patch or immediate air gapping. No waiting.
An excellent synthesis of the technical and operational lessons. Now, for the final provocative thought, something for you, the security architect or CSO listening, to mull over as you analyze your own infrastructure.
We spent time establishing the high-impact scores for confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the VCH, VIH, VAH on this application, which, let's be honest, is often dismissed as minor infrastructure. The fact that a non-critical application can hold data or be used as a pivot point that merits a critical rating, well, it raises a fundamental enterprise security question. Should we still apply a criticality assessment based on the function of an application? Or should the baseline be determined by its architecture specifically, its exposure to the network, and its ability to store privileged data or configuration? If unauthenticated network access can lead to HHH impact on a standalone server, shouldn't our segmentation policies and our patch management mandates be identical to those for our core business systems? Where does your internal Emby server sit in that risk matrix?